Have you been told to follow your heart or trust your heart or let your heart guide you? We all have. This metaphor has been used throughout human history to connect us with that guiding force inside of us. Well, it turns out that these metaphors that we use, are actually scientifically validated truths. That is just so interesting to me, and we learn all about that in today's episode of the Alter Your Health podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Benjamin Alter, licensed naturopathic doctor based in Carbondale, Colorado, serving the whole wide world online via Alter Health Services. So head on over to www.alter.health to learn more about what we have for you. But this is not about me. This is about our guest and the research that he has been a part of throughout his fruitful career and his connection with the HeartMath Institute. So our guest today is Dr. Rollin McCraty. He is a PhD and Director of Research of the HeartMath Research Center at the HeartMath Institute. As a psychologist, Dr. McCraty's research interests include the physiology of emotion, the heart-brain communication, and the global interconnectivity between people and the Earth's energetic systems. Just some things that we talk about in our conversation today, one of which is this relationship between humans and the Earth, and how the Earth's energies and actually the energy of the sun influences how we feel and how we behave. Super fascinating stuff, and so stay tuned for some good stuff in this conversation. Some of the findings from Dr. McCraty's research have been applied to the development of tools and technology to optimize individual and organizational health, performance, and quality of life. Dr. McCraty has acted as principal investigator in numerous studies examining the effects of emotions on heart-brain interaction on autonomic, cardiovascular, hormonal, and immune system function, and outcome studies to determine the benefit of positive emotion-focused interventions and heart rhythm coherence feedback in diverse organizational, educational, and various clinical populations. So I know that sounds like a lot, and this conversation is a lot. I would say it's a little bit more scientific and technical than the average conversation on this podcast. But hey, we've got to understand what's going on. So this conversation is pointing us to a deep understanding of some universal truths that I think we all resonate with. So I'm so grateful for Dr. McCraty's wisdom that he shared in this conversation. He has been featured, by the way, you might recognize his name or his face if you're watching on YouTube, from a number of documentaries that he has been a part of. So Dr. McCraty, he is not a new kid on the block. He is a really wise, experienced human being, and I could feel his passion in this conversation. So among other things in this conversation, we talk about his kind of journey, how he came to be a part of HeartMath Institute from its inception in 1991. We also talk about some of the groundbreaking research that HeartMath Institute has been a part of. We talk about heart rate variability, the science of heart rate variability and cardiac coherence, what that means and how that influences our experience of health and well-being, both physically and energetically or emotionally. We also talk about, like I said, the science of intuition and how we are actually truly guided by our hearts, whether we know it or whether we are connected with that reality or not. And we also talk about the Global Coherence Initiative, one of the latest, if you will, revelations at the HeartMath Institute, talking about how a global coherence, or the awareness of that heart connection amongst a large population, can influence one another and maybe the earth itself. So really fascinating stuff, and also really hopeful and empowering stuff when we consider where we're at in this crazy world and how crazy our geopolitical environment is. So we do have some control and some creative potential in how we're interfacing with our world. I think that's one big takeaway. And also, some resources that aren't really mentioned too much in this conversation are the resources that are available through HeartMath. Specifically, they have a wonderful app and a heart rate variability sensor. The Inner Balance app, which you need the little sensor that I think clips onto your ear to measure your heart rate variability or cardiac coherence. That's a really cool tool, a really great way to develop that biofeedback and to support your holistic health and well-being. So if you'd like more information and to access the show notes from this episode or any other episode, head on over to www.alter.health/podcast. This is episode number 138. That means we've got 137 other episodes that might be inspirational and supportive of your health and wellness journey. On that note, I just invite you to sit back, relax, connect with your heart, take a breath, and most importantly, exhale, and enjoy this wonderful conversation with our guest, Dr. Rollin McCraty. Welcome to the Alter Your Health podcast, Dr. Rollin McCraty. So happy to have you. So happy to dive into some heart science.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'd like to start by just, getting to know a little bit about your journey. I've heard you talk about multiple careers, so to speak. So how did you get into, your work that you're doing with the HeartMath Institute, and just share with us a little brief evolution of your professional journey?
Oh, wow. Well, let's see if I can give you the Cliff Notes version of that one. Started out as a communications engineer. Used to work for Motorola, and was also, as from a very young age, was always interested in electromagnetics and what is this stuff and these types of things. And I won't go through all that history, but somehow along the way I got interested in some of the more subtle energies and these types of things around magnetics that were never really answered in my classical training and schooling. And so I actually moved to California in the late 70s, I guess it was, to check out this university that had, as the first degree granting institution I know of in consciousness studies. So I got involved in that, and through that, some people there was actually involved in the group that introduced spirulina to the world for the first time. And
Spirulina, the algae?
Spirulina the algae as a humanitarian project to really feed the world's hungry populations. And so we, long story short, National Enquirer did a front page cover story on it, along the way, and which the company just mushroomed into in fact, in the position I had at that time, we were about $150,000 a month company, and in the next 2 weeks, I think I wrote a little over $20 million in orders for spirulina. It was just huge impact. The long story short, there's many sub stories around that. We took those profits and built a demonstration plant in Southern California in the desert to prove that you could feed the world's hungry populations. And way ahead of our time, solar powered spray dryers. This is in the early 80s. And not to drag this story out too long, but that basically, even though we had proved the technology would work, it didn't go anywhere. It was blocked at all kinds of levels, political levels, and so on. And it became clear there were forces that didn't want the hungry people fed.
Interesting. Yeah.
So at that time, I had been a meditator and practiced these things, although never really got totally sucked into the new age type stuff because I was too much of an engineer type at the same time, but some concepts around it. Anyway, I would say to people and myself that, hey, it's all about consciousness. We need to raise consciousness. Well, it was through that experience that became a very visceral and deep understanding that, yes, that's really what this is about. It's not about technology. The technology exists. It exists now. It existed then to solve most of the problems we really have. So I said, no, the heck with this humanitarian stuff. I'm going to go make money again, for myself. So I started another company in electrostatics. It became a very successful company in a fairly short time. And through that, don't get me wrong, I had a great ride and it was a lot of fun. And but a few years into that, there was this deeper urge in me that another sports car in the driveway wasn't necessarily going to do it on a deeper level. And through that, actually, some contacts I had through the older days of spirulina and stuff, it said, you need to meet this guy, Doc Childre. I think you'd hit it off. So I happened to be he lived on the East Coast at that time. So thought I'd go stop by. I had to be out there for other business, go meet this guy, spend an hour or so. And 3 days later, I finally came home. And it's through that experience in meeting Doc Childre that, because I had kind of vowed, one part I'd left out of the backstory there is that until something comes along that can really help lift consciousness in a meaningful way at a mass level, why bother? So it was through that experience meeting him that I realized, wow, there really is something here that could help lift consciousness. So basically I sold that company and joined with Doc and a few other people to help found HeartMath.
Wow, super cool. Yeah, I love the journey and love the thread of, just really seeking that pure conscious evolution. And it's like I can kind of hear and feel that on some level. At some points you got a little jaded, but you got reinvigorated, and that thread of that pure intention to raise conscious awareness never wavered, never faded.
Yeah, another way I say it is that my idealism bubble got popped, kind of got down to what it's really about.
Mm-hmm. But here we are, how many decades later? What was the founding date of HeartMath? 1990?
Well, we really, I would say, came together in 1987, and HeartMath was officially founded as HeartMath as a nonprofit in 1991, I guess.
Great. So what would you say, what is the mission of HeartMath Institute?
Well, the simple way of saying it is activating the heart of humanity.
Mm-hmm. Through?
Well, that's the mission. Is by doing that, we do that in a lot of different ways. Primarily, we over the years developed really, we call it the HeartMath system, which is very simple, practical techniques that really help people align with the intuitive guidance of their heart, which unfolds really the pathway for them, really unfolding to becoming who they really are, which is more compassionate, loving individuals at our higher levels.
Mm-hmm. And you are the research director now at the HeartMath Institute. So over the course of the evolution of HeartMath, what have been some of the kind of groundbreaking or revolutionary understandings of the heart and the heart-brain connection?
Yeah, well, there've been a few kind of pivotal moments. Kind of hard to remember them all in a way. It's been at this close to 30 years now. So one, we started out here in the lab, trying to become psychophysiologists, and I ended up getting a degree in psychophysiology, after starting the research. But having my background and some of the people I brought with me were pretty skilled in signal processing and, electrical type stuff and magnetics and so on. So we started by looking at physiological correlates, what goes on in our body, things that we can measure that correlate with emotion, stress, and emotions. And this, so remember, this is early 90s, and this is long before the positive psychology movement and these types of things. I think at that time there were maybe 3, maybe 4 papers in the peer-reviewed literature, medical literature, on positive emotions at that time. It was very, very scant. So we were kind of among the first to not only look at things like frustration and anger and, more of what we back then would have called negative emotions, more call them depleting emotions now, but also looking at things, what happens when people are actually have heartfelt states of love and compassion and appreciation. And then we're also taking a little deeper look at the heart because of some of our more intuitive insights to the heart and personal experiences there than probably was happening at that time. And to make a long story short, I mean, we were looking at, EEGs, brain waves, skin conduction, all the traditional stuff one would look at. But it actually turned out that it was the heart, in particular, what's now called heart rate variability, but the beat-to-beat change in our heart rate, which is a good thing that we have, but the patterns of it that was most reflective of a person's emotional state. So that was a pretty big insight. We were the first to actually show that. We now know many years later that you can actually identify discrete emotional states just from the heart rate variability signal with about 75% accuracy. That's unheard of, from a single physiological measure like that. So that was one of the first kind of ahas. And around that same time was really the big one that really started a whole journey, was that when people are really, really feeling, not thinking, that doesn't work, right? But the heartfelt feelings of things like appreciation, that not only the rhythm of the heart changed, but it changed into a very dramatically different and distinctive state. And it was actually a state shift that we now call coherence. It took a while to determine that. We had a pretty impressive scientific advisory board we collected, and it took us about 2 years to figure out what we were going to call this new state, and a lot of thought went into that back then. So now I can say 400, this many years later, there's now been 400 studies independent of us published on the benefits of helping people get into a heart coherent state. But in the beginning, we didn't really understand all that and why. And so that was a pretty pivotal moment, actually, was seeing that there's a state shift associated with these regenerative emotions like appreciation and compassion when we really feel them. And that then led to a whole lot of other unfoldings and understandings about the heart brain, that the heart actually has its own nervous system. The heart sends more information to the brain, and really understanding why that was true, what we would observe back then was true, and so fundamental to our psychophysiology and how we really operate in terms of the heart brain being so interconnected. Mm-hmm. So that was one. And then we went into studies on intuition and found that the heart is the first to receive non-local information and sends a measurably different neural signal to the brain, right, than the brain to the body, where we feel it, but it's really the heart first.
Before we move on to other things, I feel like there's maybe a little bit more to dive into, of course, in terms of heart rate variability and cardiac coherence.
Of course there is, yeah.
So one question that I have is, a way that I explain it to people, as far as my understanding of heart rate variability, it is the strength of the parasympathetic nervous system. Is that accurate?
No, not really.
That too simple? Yeah, correct me.
Well, it's not wrong, but it's not complete. So let me start by saying I'm kind of known for saying this. Heart rate variability, for people who aren't familiar with that, is, well, in a healthy person, our heart rate changes with each and every heartbeat. There's variation between the time of every heartbeat. And so to measure, which is very different than heart rate, which is just simply how many times is a heartbeat in a minute, right? But in reality, in a healthy person, our heart rate's changing with each and every beat. And you could kind of think of it like Morse code. So there's time intervals between the heartbeats that actually is one of the ways our body encodes information. So these patterns of information have profound effects body-wide. And that's the measurement of that's called heart rate variability. And we have more of it when we're young, just the amount of this variation we have in beat-to-beat change in heart rate, and it gets less as we age. And there's pretty much a linear relationship between how much of this HRV we have and our age. Okay, so it's what I was really going to start this conversation saying that HRV is really simple. It's the beat-to-beat change in heart rate, or you can spend an entire career trying to understand it and all that it unfolds and impacts it. And that's really true. It's really reflecting I'll call it for now, the health of the entire neural axis. The brain, the higher brain, lower brain, the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system in the heart as an integrated system. Now, one of the nerves, which you brought up, Benjamin, is the vagus nerve, is the parasympathetic branch, comes down through the front of our body that does have impact on beat-to-beat heart rate. But so does our spinal nerve system, the sympathetic system. And not only so we tend to think about HRV as being what the brain's doing, sending down signals to the heart. And that actually is true. That's part of it. And so there's also what are called the afferent or the ascending pathways are just as critical for healthy HRV as the descending, both through the vagus and the sympathetic system. So it's a much more complicated than just the vagus, is why I said yes, but no.
Yes,
we can't, and there's many ways, many tools we have for analyzing HRV where we can discriminate. Is this vagal or parasympathetic mediated, or sympathetic or afferent versus efferent, and really look much deeper into not the health of the whole integrated system. So I don't want to overcomplicate it here, but
well, thank you. No, thanks for clarifying and expanding a little bit. So beyond age, knowing that direct correlation between aging and decreased heart rate variability, what are other factors that can be controlled for that correlate with increased or decreased heart rate variability?
Okay, so now you're talking about the amount of variability we have, and
and maybe to pause before you answer, is more heart rate variability healthy?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'll come back to this, but preface by saying there are two different levels of HRV that, at a simple level, the statement one is how much. And then the other is what's the rhythm, what's the pattern of the HRV, which actually reflects an even deeper level of information than the how much question. Okay, so the how much, which you're absolutely right, decreases with age. So one of the, this wasn't our focus of the HRV research, but it's well established now that if we have lower HRV than we should have for our age, that is a strong and independent risk factor, put it that way, for future health problems like dying. It's a pretty serious health problem. And in fact, I would say it's a more, if you have low HRV for your age, as a physician, you need to be more concerned about that patient than if they have high blood pressure or high cholesterol and all these types of other risk factors. It's a pretty serious marker. And we now know that low HRV can also drop out or become lower than it should be for your age, up to 2 or even, well, at least 2 years, even longer before the onset of symptoms, and like the diabetes and neuropathy and metabolic syndrome and a bunch of other cancer and so on. So it's the how much question is, if it's lower than it should be for our age, I think of it as a wonderful measure of, I just call it functional status of the whole integrated system. So if you have low HRV, right, for your age, that we can't say, oh, you're going to get cancer or you're going to die a sudden cardiac death, but we know something's way wrong and something serious is much more likely to happen in your future. Right? So it's not specific, but it's a great general overall marker of something deeper going on. So that would be one important way it's used in clinical medicine. So did that answer your question? I mean, I could go on there a bit.
Yeah, if you could give some examples. I understand it being a risk factor for all sorts of conditions because of, what all the words that I'll use is that it kind of represents the body's alignment, so to speak. Are you in resonance, in alignment, attuned, or are you out of sync, out of resonance, out of harmony? So what are some things? I know that emotions are strong, things, if we call emotions things, that can bring us into and out of resonance. But what are some other things that can increase our heart rate variability? If someone is, going to the doctor and the doctor is measuring an HRV and it's low, what are some therapies that could raise it?
I'm gonna answer that in a reverse way, if I may.
Great.
Because one of the first things, certainly a disease process can lower HRV, like diabetes or neuropathy. High inflammatory processes are one of the main culprits we now know that will lower HRV. But what's driving that more often than not? So what we see, we do analysis for clinics all over the world, by the way. We have a clinical HRV service we do as part of our research, is stress. So long-term stress accumulated stress, chronic stress, you want to call it that, is probably the number one culprit in causing lowered HRV. Okay. So I think that's a base to start from. Why does it be low? So to answer your question, it's really about how do we remove the extra wear and tear we're putting on the nervous system and the biochemical systems of the body, which is stress. And stress is one of those words. It's kind of safe to say you're stressing me out. But if we really look a little bit deeper under the hood of that term stress, it's almost always an unmanaged emotion. It's the anxiety, frustration, overwhelm, feelings of, it's all these emotions, which are the primary drivers of the activity in our body. A lot of people don't realize that. They think it's thoughts and thinking, but changing a thought does very little to change physiological activity. I mean, yeah, we can measure some changes, but not much. But as soon as you feel something, right, like frustration or impatience, which is kind of rampant in society, right, that causes profound changes in our nervous system activity, in our hormonal system. And it's the accumulated wear and tear of that and the inflammatory processes that go along with that in often cases that are leading to reduced HRV. So one of the best things we can do to increase HRV is stop the stress, the extra wear and tear on the system. And that's really what HeartMath, but many other great programs out there are about, is how do we finally manage our emotions. Now I'm going to circle back a little bit, as I said I would. So that will, in fact, we've seen people's HRV recover back to normal through a really good stress management program. But a key to that, so there's the amount, but also the pattern that's reflected in the rhythm. This is where a picture's worth 1,000 words. So when we're feeling, if you plot the HRV, the actual rhythm, the heart rhythm, when we feel things like frustration or impatience, you have a very chaotic, jerky looking rhythm. That's actually reflected in your heart rhythm. So that's, and anxiety looks a little bit different than frustration and so on, but they're all this chaotic, or what we now call incoherent heart rhythm. And that's actually reflecting, to your point, a lack of synchronization within the body systems, especially the higher brain systems. That's being reflected in the body. And that's what adds this extra wear and tear and energy and extra energy utilization to the body, which is why so many people, that if we are going through a stressful day, we feel exhausted at the end of the day. An analogy I use, if I may, that is very good for this, it's very accurate, is it's like driving your car with one foot on the gas pedal and the other riding the brake with the other foot. It creates a jerky ride, right? And we use a lot more gas, and it puts a lot more stress and wear and tear on a lot of the parts of the car, the brakes and the drivetrain and so on. It's the same thing in us. Now here's where coherence is an important factor, because it's really about the pattern of the HRV. When we are able to kind of have more choice in our emotional diet, learn to bit more self-regulate and align with our deeper self, so we become more appreciative and grateful and more compassionate and have latitude for people and so on. That those feelings are reflected in the coherent rhythm, which is a very nice, smooth sine wave looking heart rhythm pattern, which is really showing that our inner systems are literally in sync, in harmonious. It's a very energy efficient state. So that's a very long-winded answer. I hope I didn't go too long there, but
no, great. I'm right there with you all the way. And that brings another question about like the change in heart rate variability. I actually have an app that I use that is kind of geared towards athletes and measuring their heart rate variability. I measure it every morning, and it can be kind of sporadic, kind of all over the place.
Sure.
And so if someone is chronically low heart rate variability, what's the hope to dramatically change that to some sort of normal or increased heart rate variability?
I kind of already answered that. But again, most people that have, well, let me back off a little bit here and say that when we look at how much HRV around an age, there's what we call normative ranges for certain ages. And that's a fairly wide range, that you should be in, within that range. Now, towards the top of that range of amount of variability are the people that have the more variability for a given age, or are the really people who are really doing everything kind of right. They're getting proper exercise and not too much exercise where they're depleting the system or overtraining. The apps you're talking about are used. Having a reasonable diet and I've got a pretty good handle on managing stress. Then you've got the lower level of the range, and these are people who are still healthy. They don't have a disease and aren't taking medications and things, but I call them the healthy couch potatoes. Right. So you've got a range you can float around in and still be. So it's when you drop below the bottom of that range that we get really concerned that this is where you're at high risk for future health problems. Okay. So you can float around in that normal range, like with the apps you're talking about. There is variation. And I don't know if your own experience, you probably notice if you had a bad day, didn't sleep well, had a lot of stress, that your morning, you probably do it in the mornings, I would assume that's when most people do, that you're a little bit lower than you were another day. Has that kind of been your observation?
Well, to be honest with you, for me, I find that I am really sporadic and there isn't really a rhyme or reason, but not sporadic, like on an out of healthy range. I stay within healthy range.
That's the point I'm making. You're within the healthy range, and there is variation. But it usually has to do with kind of your own energy reserves, and so I'm not a huge fan of those apps, to be honest, because of that, and some of the claims that are made. But it's kind of fun to track it and watch.
Yeah, it's kind of, I'm hoping to develop a little bit of, it's biofeedback. I'm hoping to develop a little attunement to, I didn't sleep well and, it's a little down this morning, but I haven't yet developed that refined attunement.
And it can also be another factor that we now know. I mean, if we get more into our current work, is we now know that the background energetics of the planet also have an effect. Yeah. And will affect our HRV.
Definitely want to get there. There's a lot of things that I want to unpack in this conversation. So maybe we've spent enough on heart rate variability and cardiac coherence. That's kind of.
Let me just say one more thing.
Yes.
And what I would even encourage you to maybe try is you can play with the app you've got, which is, I know pretty much probably what it is or what type of app. One of our apps called Inner Balance. If you're not, I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Yeah, for sure.
It's an app that helps you practice becoming more heart coherent.
Yes.
I don't know if you use that or not, but if not, try practicing that at regular times and see if that doesn't maybe kind of stabilize or maybe even over time, a few months start increasing your baseline or your level of HRV as you practice those kind of skills.
Oh yeah. The one more question about HRV. The one thing that I have found to be the most dramatic thing, and based on my personal experience and also my understanding of anatomy and physiology, is breathing and a lengthened exhale, which, as I know, kind of activates the vagal nerve. And is that, or you can correct me, you're the real researcher, but it does increase heart rate variability, correct?
No, I wouldn't say. When we say increase, so that's why I say you can spend a lifetime trying to understand this, but it's really simple. So there's overall HRV, how much we have overall, and that's best assessed over 24 hours because it's varying. It's up and down, changing. And when you look at the patterns of HRV over 24 hours, you can I can look at these rhythms and tell somebody's personality pretty much just from looking at their HRV over 24 hours. I've done so much of this, but there's lots of variations throughout a day. You'll have high here, low there. That's why you really need to look over 24 hours to really know how much HRV someone has. But when you look over the 24 hours, you'll see that all these changes in pattern and amount are actually very deep insights into what's going on in our nervous system at that time. Okay, so there's the overall amount, but then there's state-specific changes in HRV. Right? Like we're having a conversation now, so my HRV is going to be very different than if I'm having a heated conversation with someone, or I'm working on my computer and have a high cognitive workload. These are all things that reflect in these short-term or state-specific changes.
And is breath and the quality of breath also reflected?
Breath is one of many things that modulate heart rate variability. So that's often called respiratory sinus arrhythmia.
Yes.
Kind of a weird, strange name for it.
Yeah.
But here's the mechanism of that. There's several, but the primary mechanism of why we can actually look at your heart rate variability and tell exactly what your breathing cycle is, okay, or how deep and the frequency. So there are in the lungs there are neurons that are stretch sensitive neurons, and we breathe in. You know, the lung stretch. Those neurons increase their firing output, so they go up to the basically I'll just call it the medulla, the brainstem area, and you could think of it like a little switch that's in the efferent or descending outflow from the parasympathetic system through the vagus nerve to the heart. So when we breathe in, those neurons fire, they inhibit or kind of open the switch so you don't have as much parasympathetic or vagal activity to the heart, right? And so parasympathetic slows heart rate. So when you inhibit that, heart rate goes up, right? So when you breathe in, your heart rate increases, right? You breathe out, that those neurons are released. They quit firing as strongly. You close the little gate, the little switch, so you have the vagal outflow going down the heart, so heart rate decreases. So you're modulating the rhythm. So you don't really increase overall HRV, but if you're breathing deeply and rhythmically, you can see a state-specific increase in the HRV while you're doing that.
I see.
Okay? Now, a little trick you can do, and we teach this in some of our programs, is if you want to, over a minute or so, increase or decrease your heart rate, like maybe you just exercised and wanted to get your heart rate down a little faster, or just, had a stressor or something, you can do exactly what you're saying. Breathe out a little longer when you're breathing in, change the cycle. So now you're overall down regulating heart rate. Or you can do the opposite if you need to up your heart rate. You're getting ready to do, play a game, or play some sports, or be in a meeting where you need to be your best, where you actually want heart rate a little bit higher. You actually reverse it, right? So that way you can up ramp your system a little bit.
Yeah.
Hopefully that
And when, for the layman out there, when we're talking about up ramping and down ramping or quieting, we could kind of generalize like increased sympathetic tone, or
no, but you're not. See, this is all vaguely mediated through the modulation of the heart, through the vagus, through the breathing.
So you're inactivating parasympathetic, right, or activating parasympathetic.
Yeah. Well,
not necessarily increasing sympathetic.
Yeah, you're basically modulating the flow of the parasympathetic through the brainstem to the heart.
Got it. Yeah.
So when we talk about really activating, putting more signals in that you would modulate through breathing, that's a different. See, that's where it gets. A lot of it's oversimplified in the way we think about this stuff.
Yeah.
So a term I like to use is vagal activity, right? So in the vagus, and the activity through the parasympathetic has a lot to do with emotion, right? In terms of how activated is it, of the amount of signals that we're putting into the system to begin with, that the breathing then modulates.
Got it.
Yeah,
it helps. I mean, it does, in my oversimplified mind, it does kind of confuse things a little bit, but it does at the same time, it helps to clarify and understand that it's not exactly as I understand it and teach.
Yeah, so let me give you an example, Benjamin. If you're under a high cognitive workload, you're really, studying something, and you really, got a lot going on, that will reduce the amount of vagal activity to begin with. So even the breathing modulation will be a lot lower modulation of the heart rhythm than if you're more relaxed and they don't have a high cognitive workload going on.
So just so I understand, I'll put this out there now and you can correct me again. There's many inputs that, dictate our heart rate variability and, nervous system state. And one of them is breathing. One of them is our emotional state. You talked before about the bioenergetics of the world. And what are some other things that influence the state of our nervous system?
Well, I mean, those are important ones, but if you had a cup of coffee, right, you've got stimulants in the nervous system. I mean, the biochemistry, would be obvious ones, for example.
Great.
anyway, go ahead. We
Yeah.
could spend all day here.
So you talked, I cut you off as you were sharing some of the biggest insights and research, revolutions in the history of HeartMath, and we focused a lot on heart rate variability and cardiac coherence, which kind of stems from that, and that's really the basis of things that are going on at the HeartMath Institute. And you started talking about the intuition research that you have going, that you've also done in the past. Share a little bit about some of the biggest findings about the heart and intuition, because I always find it so fascinating that we talk about, following the heart, connecting with your heart, listening to your heart, being guided by your heart. And it's not a metaphor, it's reality. So share with us how it is a reality.
Certainly from my perspective, yes.
Yeah.
In fact, we started the line of intuition research. This is going back to the later 90s, because so many people who were practicing HeartMath skills, the tools and techniques that allow us to shift into coherence in the moment. And that's, I should just say there that a lot of what we focus on is about how do we get into a more coherent, healthy state in the moment when we're in the traffic jams, right, of life, literally and figuratively. That's why HeartMath is so popular with law enforcement and first responders, where you really you want a higher heart rate, a lot of those cases, but you want to be able to maintain your composure and really maximize cognitive function, which is really what coherence does. And we think better, more emotionally stable when we're able to shift into that coherent state. But anyway, we were teaching these techniques for years and across many types of audiences and populations. And one of the most common things we hear back then and still is my intuition is like radically different. It's like on steroids now. And then the second thing they would usually say is, and the synchronicities in life are just, which I believe are because of the intuition that guides us into those. Given hearing that so much, we kind of set out to see if we could measure this intuition stuff. And many years later, I would now say that I would like to start the conversation by saying there are 3 primary types of intuition. I think it just helps ground things. First type we call implicit learning or implicit knowledge. And that's the one that's most studied in academia because it's safe. That's where we've learned something and didn't know we learned it or forgot we learned it, and it's stored away in the unconscious parts of our brain, just to keep it simple now. So we encounter a new problem and the brain does rapid pattern matching, we have the aha, that's a type of intuition, an important type. The second type I call energetic sensitivity, and this is our nervous system's capacity to detect and respond to real signals in the environment. So people might feel like somebody's staring at you, and you turn around, and sure enough, right? There have been several studies that have verified that particular example. Empathy is in that category. We know that there's a real energetic communication that goes on between people. That's a whole other category we didn't get to yet of our research that actually showed that the heart radiates magnetic fields. It's detected by other people. It has measurable state changes between people. So that's energetic sensitivity in a brief way. And then the third category we call non-local intuition. And that's the kind of intuitions you can't write off through the other two, right, that have to do with across time and space. That could be, there's a gazillion examples, and I'm sure everybody listening has their own. Kind of a common one is you think about somebody you haven't thought of, or a friend from childhood or something in years, right? Suddenly, I wonder what's up with Joe Bob or whatever, right? And you get a phone call from them, in a few hours later, or the next day, or that kind of thing.
Yeah, it seems like on those examples of intuition, it kind of increases in the woo-woo spectrum, so to speak.
We've taken it out of woo-woo because we've developed 2 different types of protocols to prove that this is a very real type of intuition. And you ask any mother, and they know when their kid's up to no good or in harm's way, and they can be on the other side of the planet. I mean, these are so common. We could do a whole interview just on non-local intuition and all the evidence for it. But So anyway, we developed several different protocols. I mean, these are very rigorous. I won't go into all. This is all published for people that want to go into detail. You have to be really careful in these kind of experiments because, where we're measuring brain waves and hearts. And I think the most profound of those series of studies, and by the way, there's even meta-analysis now. So much research has been done since we started this.
Wow, cool.
Confirmed on it. 2 different meta-analyses that confirm this. We can measure this non-local intuition. And I'm not going to take all the time that would require to go through all the protocols, but the takeaway message here is what we were looking for. Can we really study when, where, and how? What is the flow of intuitive information in the body, in the system, in our psychophysiological systems? And it even surprised us what we found. So what we found is that in the case of the non-local intuition, that the heart is the first system to change and give you what we call pre-stimulus signal, a measurable change. At the heart, send a measurably different neurological signal to the brain, all before the thing in the future was going to happen. Then you measure changes in the brain, and then you see changes going down to the body, like the gut, the hair on the back of the neck, which is where it becomes conscious if we're paying attention. So the gut gets the credit a lot of times, right? The gut feeling or the hair on the back of the neck. But the real flow is heart first, then signal to the brain, and brain to the body, then conscious perception of the feeling or the intuition. So that was a pretty profound insight as well.
Yeah.
Because it really verified, I think, what you were saying, Benjamin, about so many sayings in our language where we intuitively know this, like listen to your heart and play with the heart, or the courage and all the things associated with the heart. And this is really what we used to have. Our education director was a guy from UCLA with 3 PhDs in this type of work. And one of his things was he was a scholar of the world's religions. And very clearly, the most common denominator and theme across all the world's great religions is the idea of the heart being the access point to that deeper part of ourselves. Right, courage and wisdom and intelligence. In fact, heart intelligence goes back many thousands of years in some of these traditions. So this is some of the most, as far as I know, that research that we did on intuition is really the strongest physiological based evidence for saying, yeah, they've been right all along.
Yeah, it just makes me realize that all of these metaphors, that have been used throughout history, like you just pointed to, it's amazing because it goes to show that there has been a real connection with that inherent knowing and wisdom, like that. It's not just woo-woo. And I think that we all know that, and we've all had those experiences of, wow, that was a real insight, that was a real intuition, a real inner knowing. But you mentioned, before we got onto this topic, you mentioned how people going through the inner balance exercises enhance their connection with their intuition.
Right.
What is that mechanism, if you will, of enhancing your intuition?
Well, in that case, it's not just the inner balance or M-Wave, these devices. Those are devices that measure your HRV and show you the pattern and tell you how coherent you are. But they're really meant to be used along with the HeartMath techniques, which are ways that you shift into coherence. And in fact, a technique called freeze frame is really all about how do we access our deeper heart's intuition. It's a really powerful exercise.
Yeah, I'm familiar with freeze frame. So what is the mechanism then of freeze frame increasing intuition?
Yeah. So I necessarily can't prove this yet, but you also can't prove it's not this way. Right. Yeah. In fact, that study I was just referring to actually supports this. So what we're suggesting here at HeartMath is that we have the physical heart, but we also have an energetic heart, which is a very real thing with real structure, just in another dimension of density. And that the heart really is not metaphorically, but literally the connection point, or the transceiver is a word we could use, right, between whatever people want to call it. All cultures have their own word. It could be your higher self, your soul, your spirit. We here at HeartMath, we just call it your larger self, right, to take religion out of it. It's just saying that we really do have an energetic system that is part of our undivided wholeness. That we can call it your larger self, and that the heart is the place that's transformed down into the physical system, the heart, mind, and DNA and all that into the physical system. So that this, what people have been saying is not a metaphor. So when you become more coherent, you're doing several things. You're stabilizing our own body emotional system, right, and mind, and you're opening that channel just like a radio dial. Like I'm old enough to remember back when we had radios, you had to tune the knob, right, to get the station clear. Getting coherent is like tuning our inner dial to become aligned with and to our own larger self. So that to me, the real intuition I'm talking about, the kind that is transformative in people's lives, is when we align with our deeper heart's intuition. So it is that flow of information from our larger self down through the heart, down into the heart, mind, brain system here in our body, that gives us that inner guidance system. It's who we really are that we're aligning with at our deeper.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people talk about that kind of receiver kind of metaphor, that we are this receiver for greater energy.
But I'm saying that's not a metaphor.
Right. That's what So it's interesting to hear you talk about this from a real, obviously we haven't gotten into the real science behind it.
And I'm also not saying universal energy. I'm saying, no, it's you in your own larger self that's part of our integrated wholeness as an individual energy unit, if you want to think of that, or human being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's empowering. It's empowering and humbling and almost overwhelming to think of that potential, if you will, of just what's possible, or what the future might hold in our greater understanding of this human potential to connect with our larger self.
Yeah, and so it's that flow, right, from our larger self that elevates consciousness.
And when you say elevates consciousness, when you use those terms, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I'm gonna use the word awareness.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is consciousness, but as we become more aligned with our deeper self, right, our larger self, that does elevate our awareness. So we start making better choices that are better for us and the wholeness. We become more inclusive. We become much more capable of really self-regulating, and when we align with that, our emotions, thoughts and emotions. So that's what really cuts stress out. So I'm going to suggest here that in today's world, that the biggest issue going on right now for most people is stress. I mean, they're overwhelmed.
Yeah.
I probably should have asked you how many of your patients are stressed out, overwhelmed, and exhausted, right? I asked that question to most groups of physicians, and every hand in the room goes up.
It's 100%. It's just whether or not we're really attuned and aware of it.
The suggestion, Benjamin, here is that we have to really connect. You can call it with your spiritual self if you want, but I'm really meaning our larger self as a real thing here, right? That it just operated in another dimension, a frequency domain at the energetic level, that gives us finally the power to bring our thoughts and emotions into alignment. And that is by far the biggest way of cutting stress out and facilitating the body's natural regenerative systems that there is. So that's why it's so transformational for people. I mean, you wouldn't believe the letters and stories we have from people practicing HeartMath of how it's just transformed their lives.
The beautiful thing to me is that what we're talking about when we're talking about transformation, we're talking about kind of a spiritual, if you will, emotional transformation, connection with our larger self, and connection with oneness and that great feeling. We're also talking about physical transformation of health and our well-being in our physical world reality. So I feel like we could, go on and deeper in any one of these topics so much so, but I'm curious what's kind of the on the frontiers at HeartMath Institute. What's kind of, in the world of research development, beyond intuition and heart rate variability and cardiac coherence, what's next?
Yeah, what's kind of next is happening now. In a way, we've spent many years talking about personal coherence and the health benefits. And like I said, 400 independent studies now published on the benefits of learning to be coherent across all kinds of populations and issues. So now our focus is more on social coherence. Yeah, so I mean, we have coherence within us at the personal level, but also coherence within our social circles, whether that's our families, our work teams, communities, and ultimately the world. So how do we create more coherence, which really has to do with the harmonious relationships within a group? How well do we get along? Can we clear the histories and the separations? Not that everybody has to be best friends, right? But at the same time, developing another level of group and team coherence. So we're developing new programs for groups and teams to that, and we're also, so that's a whole bucket we could spend a whole interview on. But also the global coherence, in fact, GCI for short, the Global Coherence Initiative, is a project of ours. It's about 12 years into it. It's life now. And there we're literally measuring. We've installed very specialized magnetometers around the planet. So we're measuring literally the rhythms and resonant frequencies in the magnetic environment of Earth. And we had to do this ourselves. There are many magnetometers out there, but they don't measure the time varying or the moving of the resonant frequencies, or more measuring the strength of the field. And just to make, I know we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to try and make a long story short here. Basically, if I need to get a little Earth here or something for a prop, but if you think of my fist as Earth, and we have the Earth's magnetic field, the geomagnetic field, right, the North and South Pole. So these are the magnetic fields around the Earth. And if you think back to when we were in school in science class, and you got to dump iron filings on a glass plate, remember that? You put a magnet under it, and they all magically jump around and line up, showing you the shape of the magnetic field of whatever type magnet you have. But if you remember, those iron filings lined up in lines, right? It wasn't just homogeneous black blob. They're very specific lines. And those are called magnetic field lines. So around Earth, the magnetic field, the geomagnetic field is the same way. And what's fascinating is that and this is not a metaphor either, this is literal, magnetic field lines, when they're plucked, right? You pluck one, they vibrate just like a guitar string. And they have a resonant frequency. That is just like in a guitar or any stringed instrument. You change the tension or the length, you change its frequency or its note. So the resonant frequency in normal times of the Earth's magnetic field lines, when you pluck them, and what's plucking them is the solar wind rushing by, about 1,000,000 miles per hour. So the magnetic field lines of Earth are vibrating, and those are called field line resonances. And what's really wild, I couldn't believe when we discovered this, is that the primary resonant frequency of Earth's field line resonances is 0.1 hertz. So exactly the same frequency as the coherent human heart rhythm.
So what does that mean?
What I just said,
what are the implications of this?
What are the implications? Well, but then we have another set of magnetic rhythms. It's a different mechanism called Schumann resonances, which are magnetic waves that are circling the Earth that are trapped between the surface of the Earth and the bottom of the ionosphere. And there's 8 of those, and they all overlap human brain waves. They're just at a lower magnetic power level than the field line resonances. So basically, Earth is literally, not metaphorically, vibrating magnetically at the same rhythms as our hearts and brains. So you ask, well, so what? Well, okay, this is the basic physics. Back to science class again. Most people got to play with tuning forks, right? You tap one and the other starts to vibrate if it's the same frequency, showing the principle of resonant coupling. And so, again, I don't have time to go into all the details here, but basically what that's showing is that when two systems oscillate or vibrate at the same frequency, you can transfer energy and information between them, right? So we have the basic physics now of how humanity can be feeding information into and out of the global field environment. Right? Which actually gives a mechanism, explains some of the other non-local intuition stuff, like how mom knows their kid on the other side of the planet is in harm's way, and so on.
And like what came up earlier in our conversation about the bioenergetic field of our globe having an impact on our personal health and well-being.
Yeah, in a measurable way. So we've done, again, I know we don't have a lot of time left here. We published multiple studies on this, but another aha finding here that totally took us by surprise, would never have predicted, is how in sync we are, our biological rhythms are with the Earth's rhythms. It's not subtle. I mean, we for most of us, are very in sync and synchronized to the Earth and with each other.
Could you give an example of that when you're talking about biological rhythms real quick?
Well, mainly our heart rhythms is one of the most profound. We actually see that the diagrams are just blow away when you see it. I mean, they're almost exact overlays so we've done multiple studies now where we have people wearing recorders that record their HRV 24 hours a day, in one case for 5 months, a group of people, and other studies for 30 days. And you can actually, the overlay of the power in the Earth's resonant frequencies and our heart rhythms, it's amazing. I mean, it's almost like they're exact in some cases. So we're far more in sync. You hear people, I've said it myself 100 times probably. Well, on some level, we're all connected, right? So this is taking the some level out of it. I'm not saying it's the only way we're interconnected, but it's a really powerful way that we are seeing measurably that we are literally in sync with the Earth. There are some people who aren't, right? And that's usually when they're stressed out and other factors we don't really understand yet. But a whole new picture that's starting to emerge now from multiple studies, and more are being published now since we published some of our initial findings. It's amazing, is that some of these kind of got a bad rap, like some of the geomagnetics, because most of the previous studies were limited in what they could measure. They only had a thing called KP index, which is a measure of magnetic disturbance that happens during solar flares. So there's been a lot of studies done on high KP index days and hospital admissions. And you see hospital admissions go way up, about 8% actually for heart disease on a magnetically field disturbed day. I mean, this is not an insignificant thing. So it kind of got this bad rap, like this is bad for us. But what we're seeing when you look at, and of course, these are older people who are right on the edge anyway, right, on hospital admissions for stroke and heart attacks and things. But when we look at healthy populations on normal days, a very different picture is emerging from multiple studies that it's to our benefit to be in sync. This actually appears to be an energy source for us. In other words, that we're not just limited to energy from food we eat, that we really are able to tune into and absorb and utilize energy from the field environment. So anyway, that's a lot said in a short statement there, but.
Yes, I saw a brief presentation that you gave showing the historical events correlating with solar activity. So we are very much on many levels invigorated and influenced by what's going on beyond us. And kind of like a final question, just to tie things together for me at least, would you say that people who do have a stronger intuition, stronger heart rate variability, more empathic, more feeling, more attuned in that way, are more influenced by this kind of stuff?
No, I'd actually say, well, it can be. There's obviously different levels of sensitivity.
Yeah.
To other people, the empathetic types and to the background fields of the Earth. But I'd actually say it's the opposite. As we learn to become more coherent, we are actually less impacted and affected by the external world, whether that's negative people or disturbed fields and that type of thing. It creates a much more stability in us and our nervous system. So we're not as influenced. But
that's good to know.
But yet more aware of.
Yeah.
At the same time.
Got it. So we're healthy, we're resilient, we feel peaceful, but we're aware of, like you said, we're attuned and awake to.
Right. So as I kind of hinted, coherence increases awareness, right, on all levels.
Yeah. Well, really fascinating stuff. I mean, I know I learned a ton in our brief conversation, and it would be nice to go back and dive into all of these rabbit holes that we kind of glossed over. But thank you so much for your time. Yeah.
And if I may, Benjamin, just say that if people want to know more about anything I talked about here and many other topics we didn't get to, check out our website at heartmath.org. And there's
Absolutely.
a research library that's hundreds of papers there. And a document, if you're into the science of this stuff, called Science of the Heart, has a bunch of chapters. It's a short book that kind of gives the summary of a lot of research in each chapter, like a chapter on intuition, one on the global coherence, one on HeartMath and education, business, different chapters like that
Yeah.
would help give an overview for people.
Yeah, HeartMath Institute, a great reference, a great resource, and thank you for all the work that you're doing and leading the way, really, in this heart revolution. And I don't know, just kind of one last question. What would you say from your, it seems like you've got this real grounded in science and also grounded in reality understanding of kind of the evolution of our times, the geopolitical climate, all of these things that are happening now. From your perspective, from a consciousness perspective, what would you say is kind of our forecast moving forward? Are things kind of looking bright for humanity and for the earth, or what?
Well, this may sound odd, but I'm very hopeful. And from my perspective and what I tend to know and understand and see through my eyes is that we are in the middle of, people talk about it all the time, the shift, right? But that is real. It's a shift in consciousness. And that shift is integrating the heart-based awareness and understanding with the mind and brain. It's not one or the other. It's about integrating and making a partnership between the two. And that is happening. And from my perspective, a lot of the stress and the extreme polarizations that are going on, and a lot of the crazy stuff we're doing on the planet that's not so good, is becoming so polarized to the point that it's part of the shift. It's got to get extreme enough for us to finally wake up and say, no, there's a better way. And so there's, from my perspective, there's two worlds going on right now at the same time. There's the stressed out kind of world, if you will, don't want to change, but then there's an awakening happening with just higher ratios than ever that I see of people that come to us or call us, and you just see it be manifested in so many ways. Of people who are waking up to a new type of awareness and calling for change. That I think it's really all just right. And
that's promising. Well, thank you so much again for your time, Dr. Rollin McCraty, and listeners, please go to HeartMathInstitute.org to learn more. All right. So
well,
peace.
Enjoyed our chat. You have a great
me too. Yeah. Peace and love. And until next time.
Take care.